George Harrison spent much of his career being known as the quiet Beatle. Compared with John Lennon's sharp humor and Paul McCartney's outgoing personality, Harrison often seemed content to stay in the background. But anyone who knew him understood that silence never meant a lack of conviction. When the conversation turned to music, George rarely held back. Long after the Beatles had gone their separate ways, he remained remarkably honest about the band's legacy. While many artists look back on their greatest successes through the lens of nostalgia, Harrison had little interest in pretending every Beatles release was equally successful. If he believed an album had fallen short, or that someone had mishandled the band's work, he said so without hesitation. One of his most candid reflections came during an interview in 1977, when he looked back on the Beatles' catalog and admitted that not every album lived up to the standards the band had set for itself. There were albums which weren't any good as far as I was concerned, he said, like Yellow Submarine. Released in January 1969, Yellow Submarine served primarily as the soundtrack to the Beatles' animated film. Unlike the group's previous studio albums, it featured only 6 new Beatles songs, while the second half of the record consisted entirely of orchestral compositions written by producer George Martin. Although Harrison admired Martin's musical abilities, the album itself never felt like a complete Beatles record. It lacked the balance and creative unity that had defined the band's strongest work throughout the 1960s. That, however, was only part of what frustrated him. As Harrison reflected on the Beatles' discography, his attention shifted away from Britain and toward the American market, where the band's albums often looked very different from the versions released in the UK. Throughout the 1960s, Capitol Records regularly reorganized the Beatles' British albums before releasing them in the United States. Songs were removed, hit singles were added, running orders were changed, and entirely new albums were assembled from recordings that had originally belonged to different projects. One of the most famous examples was Yesterday and Today. For many American listeners, the album became a familiar part of the Beatles' catalog. Harrison, however, saw it very differently. Looking back years later, he explained, "I'm talking about the English albums now, because in the States we found later that for every 2 albums we had, they'd make 3. They'd take off a bunch of tracks, change all the running order, and then they'd make new packages, like Yesterday and Today. Just awful packages." His frustration wasn't aimed at the songs themselves. Many of the recordings on Yesterday and Today came from albums that Harrison deeply admired, including Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver. What troubled him was seeing those carefully constructed albums broken apart and rearranged into something the Beatles had never intended to release. By the mid-1960s, the band had stopped thinking of albums as collections of unrelated songs. Every track was chosen for a reason, every sequence had been carefully considered, and each record reflected a particular stage in the group's artistic development. Changing that sequence changed the experience. No album illustrates that point better than Rubber Soul. Because Capitol issued a significantly altered American version, some fans have mistakenly assumed Harrison's criticism extended to Rubber Soul itself. In reality, it was one of the albums he admired most. Speaking about the record years later, Harrison said, "I think that it was the best one we made. We certainly knew we were making a good album." For him, Rubber Soul represented a turning point in the Beatles' career. The influence of Bob Dylan encouraged more thoughtful songwriting. Folk music expanded the band's musical vocabulary, and new recording techniques gave them the confidence to experiment beyond the limits of conventional pop music. The album also marked Harrison's own creative breakthrough. During the sessions for Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, he introduced the sitar into Beatles music for the first time, beginning a musical journey that would shape both his solo career and the band's future recordings. Seen from that perspective, Harrison's criticism becomes much easier to understand. He wasn't dismissing the Beatles' achievements. He was defending the artistic identity behind them. Albums such as Rubber Soul had been carefully designed as complete works, and he believed they deserved to be heard exactly as the band had created them. When those albums were reshaped for commercial reasons, something essential was lost. That same principle also explains his disappointment with Yellow Submarine. His concern was never about rejecting experimentation or criticizing individual songs. What mattered to Harrison was whether an album truly reflected the creative standards the Beatles had worked so hard to establish. George Harrison's honesty sometimes challenged the nostalgic image surrounding the Beatles, but it also revealed how seriously he took their music. Even years after the band's breakup, he judged those records by the same standards he had held while making them. For Harrison, protecting the integrity of the music mattered far more than protecting the mythology.